Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features, or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Compañeros, welcome again to the SQL Trail. It's good to have you with us again. You'll excuse, he and I are at Past Summit while this session is being put together. And so in order to meet the deadlines, I have to do this opening without him. But he is busy giving two sessions at Summit, and I have one, and we'll give a full recap in a future episode. So today we're talking about PSSDiag, and we have Jared from Channel Advisor. And I met him, and he was kind of making the case for PSSDiag and had some interesting thoughts around it. So I thought, this is something we haven't really tackled before. And so I thought it'd be interesting to get his thoughts on why we'd use it and for what purposes, right? So kind of getting started. I do think it is kind of maybe perhaps unwieldy is the right word. And so I think Jared has some interesting thoughts on how to use it, maybe under what circumstances and things like that. So I know we have lots of shout outs. No one in particular. I'm actually going to save those again because like I mentioned, we're at Past Summit announcements. I'm actually going to save those again because like I mentioned, we're at Past Summit and we're meeting lots of folks. I will say, because we just had it last night, thanks to all those who participated in our SQL Trail Mix for coming out to our event. It was great to meet a lot of you. And as far as SQL Server in the news, we're going to save a lot of that for a future episode as Microsoft did make several more announcements at Summit about what is new with SQL Server. And we got to hang out with several of the program managers talking about what kind of things they'd like to do. The URL for today's episode is going to be at sqldatapartners.com/PSSDiag. So PSSDiag. Or at sqldatapartners.com/115. So I think that's going to do it for the opening. Let's go ahead and get into the conversation. It's good to have you on, and we're kind of taking a break from our usual suspects, the Channel Advisor, and we met at the SQL Saturday in Raleigh. So ultimately, our conversation is on PSSDiag, but always good to talk with the Channel Advisor folks. And your team is growing. You've added a few new community members that I know of, and so that's always fun.
Yeah, and Anders spoke at the SQL Saturday in Charlotte recently. I think we had 5 people there.
Okay, yeah, very good.
I'm still kind of astonished by how active the DBEs and DBAs are in the community.
That's right. And so, compañeros, for those listening, and I go back to a comment that Brian made. He's one of the DBA managers over there. He said, the brightest people, some of the folks at Channel Advisor are very bright people, and you don't hear about them in the community. And while Jared, you're getting out there a bit more of late, I kind of feel like you may fit that mold. Lots of the compañeros may not know you unless they're kind of in the Raleigh or North Carolina area.
Yeah,
but hopefully that will change, particularly with this interview.
Yeah, I am trying to fit that mold. Yes.
Yeah, and I think the podcast is definitely changing that for some of the Channel Advisor DBAs that have been on.
That's right.
And I think Channel Advisor has the record now for the company that's had the most guests.
Oh, yeah,
by a long ways.
Oh, and unless we're going to count Microsoft. Microsoft may technically still be ahead.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. With all the PMs we've had on. Yeah. But yeah, other than Microsoft, yeah, those two definitely are way ahead of everybody else. So ultimately, one of the conversations we had, again, kind of going back to that Raleigh conversation, is we were talking about performance and, collecting information about this. Just talk about, collecting information about the database. And I can't remember exactly what your comment was, but you mentioned PSSDiag.
Yes.
And I think my comment was, "Ugh, does anybody still use that?" And you said, "Yes, it's great." And I thought, oh, we've got to have you on the program to talk a little bit about it. And so for those who haven't used it, and I guess let's set a little groundwork here, let's just talk about PSSDiag, what it is, and maybe even a little bit of the history of it.
Okay, so PSSDiag is this fairly all-encompassing tool that Microsoft has developed and makes publicly available. It's up on, I can't think of what the site is currently, but it's publicly available for download. And it's this all-encompassing tool that is used primarily for SQL Server performance issues. There's a few other odd circumstances you might want to run this. But mainly you use it for, and Microsoft encourages people to use it for, say, encourages people to use it to gather data about performance issues they're having with SQL Server. And it runs a performance monitor output in the background. It runs a profiler trace, or in the latest version, an X events trace if you want. It runs a bunch of queries to get information in DMVs. It'll produce like 50 or 80 files of output in the folder that it produces. And it can produce quite a large volume of data. And the idea is that you run this thing, you might run it for, say, half an hour or whatever, or if you have a different window when the problem occurs, and you know the problem might happen sometime in the next hour or so, you want to run it and capture data while whatever problem is going on. It's a really good tool in that it captures data from a lot of different sources, and you tend not to miss much with PSSDiag. There's a few odd things occasionally that you might want to add on to, say, the normal configuration, but it's a really all-encompassing tool, and it puts a lot of data at your disposal.
The things that I had heard.
Site in Charlotte for about 10 years.
Okay.
And a little bit as a contractor as well, a year and a half.
Well, now, so I have heard, and so I guess maybe you can clarify for us. So traditionally, you're going to be exposed to PSSDiag for the first time, at least I was. If your company has Microsoft support, you call them up, you're looking at a performance issue. This is the go-to tool, right, for them.
Yes, it is absolutely the go-to tool for Microsoft.
One of the things that I had heard was that if you go to their support site and what's publicly available is slightly different. True or false?
They have an internal version of the tool, yes.
Okay. But from the nuts and bolts perspective, ultimately the same? Or
ultimately the same. There might be some slight differences in some of the specifics of what options you have available. GitHub is what I was thinking of earlier. The current publicly available version is available on GitHub. And in the past, there were some slight differences. In kind of the custom configuration options you had in the internal tool and the publicly facing tool, but they're 98% the same.
Gotcha. Okay.
So then, if you're doing a support ticket with Microsoft, they're going to ask you to run this. But if you're a DBA out there in a small shop and you're having some performance issues, is this something that is going to be easy to use and just that they could run and dig through the results and get some value out of it? Or is it more just for Microsoft to use?
It is something that you can use. As far as somebody who's in a smaller shop, I would actually have less concern about somebody in a smaller shop using it than somebody in a bigger shop with very big, very active, very busy servers.
Okay.
Sure.
Depending on how it's configured. And the question's been asked many times, okay, will PSSDiag affect my performance? And the answer is possibly. And it depends on how you configure it and how busy your servers are. Troubleshooting at that time, I was worried about it. And when I started using PSSDiag in 2004, I think, I wasn't very versed in performance troubleshooting at that time either. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the perfmon data manually and looking through the profiler manually. There's also basically a sister tool with this, which is SQL Nexus, which is also available on GitHub. And what SQL Nexus does is basically grind through a lot of the data that PSSDiag provides, does some analytics on it, figures out what the biggest resource consuming queries are, your big weight types, and makes all that stuff presents it in a nice GUI so that you can see that stuff and consume it much more easily. You can slog through it manually, but SQL Nexus does make a good job of making that easier to understand.
Right.
It's
probably worth noting in the beginning. I guess I can remember being in that same state as far as just kind of getting my feet wet, so to speak, from all the tools, that are available and taking a peek at that. One of the things that is a bit, I don't know, I'll use the word overwhelming, or can be overwhelming about PSSDiag, is because it's collecting all that data. It's almost like, well, where do you start?
It is difficult to know where to start.
Yeah, and you kind of have to, I think, if you have a good understanding of what all of those pieces are, it makes it a little bit easier. But starting there, if that's like your first troubleshooting, starting place, it can be. It's going to take some time to get through. So be patient with it.
It can be intimidating at first. I do think that SQL Nexus makes a lot of that easier by kind of figuring out what's important for you and doing a lot of the analysis by itself.
Well, now, and we'll talk about some of the improvements, right? So again, my experience with PSSDiag, this is probably, so 7-8 years ago, at least now. And I remember SQL Nexus being that easier to beyond maybe what I could do at that time. I felt like I didn't have the experience, right, to get it all set up, and it never quite seemed to fit out right. Is that getting better? Is that easier to use now?
To me, that's gotten a lot better over the years. The last couple of releases have done more, and there's more things exposed, such as they added in something to get out the details of, say, SP configure, which is something that PSSDiag has gathered for a long time, but it'll flag things in that are unusual and things you might want to reconsider. I think that the GUI interface is better than it was. I think there's a lot positive to say for that tool. So I feel really good about SQL Nexus.
Gotcha.
And I kind of feel like I was doing myself a disservice because when it came out at first, I was just kind of like, I don't need that thing, because at that point I'd been using PSSDiag for a couple of years and I knew what to go and get and what to look for. Although it does in the long run, it did really save me a lot of time using Nexus.
I see. Interesting.
I see. Interesting.
So how often do you end up using PSSDiag in your job?
Currently, I do not use it very often. I mean, currently, if I'm looking at a performance issue, and this is something I started doing a lot when I was still working at Microsoft, a lot of times I'll just use DMV queries and figure out what I can from that about an ongoing situation. And I feel like that gives me information very, very quickly that I can use to diagnose problems.
Okay, great.
Now, again, going back to our conversation, one of the things you had mentioned was one of the things you thought PSSDiag was really, really good at. So we've talked about kind of collecting the metrics and whatnot. And so what are some of the compelling reasons of why you'd use PSSDiag, other than just collecting a whole bunch of metrics, like everything that you might need?
Well, it is all-encompassing and it doesn't miss a lot. So that's a positive. The perfmon collector gets you everything you're going to need in the vast majority of cases. The fact that it gets the information from the Windows event viewer can be really helpful on occasion too, especially if you've got a situation that you have disk issues, you might have errors that'll come up in, say, the system log. That's not something you'd necessarily think of unless you had a tool that was helping to expose that information for you. One of the things that I got to really be fond of, and the latest version, they have improved the ability to get X events traces. So that's something that's been in the last couple of releases, but the last one that I saw before the current release, it was still kind of a stub.
Sure. Like
there was a tab for configuring Profiler, and you really want to get away from Profiler. I wouldn't even think about running PSSDiag with Profiler on the servers at Channel Advisor in production. There's no way. There's no way.
Interesting.
Well, that's a matter of overhead. I mean, using X events traces, and I'm much more familiar. I'm more familiar at looking at Profiler traces, but I'm getting pretty familiar at X events traces.
Gotcha.
And the X event has a lot less overhead, and the overhead of Profiler can affect the performance of your system. That's a thing I've seen in the past. And the busier your server is, the more likely that is to be a problem. So the fact that they've improved it, because the X event thing used to just be a stub. And actually, I remember in one of the releases a couple of years ago, there was a tab for configuring an X event trace. And if you tried to use it, it would say, wait, this isn't actually working yet. So now it's fully functional. Now it's fully complementary or equivalent to what you could get out of Profiler. So that's good. One of the things I really, really liked out of it is in the output file, it names a lot of things based on the name of the system and then the version of SQL Server. And so the file names tend to be really long. There's one file that is a version of SQL Server, and so the file names tend to be really long. There's one file that is the perf stats startup.out. And what this script does is it has like 3 different sets of DMV queries it runs. And it does one about every minute that'll do things like getting information from DMOS, not waiting task, but DMOS wait stats. And it has another one that'll run maybe every 30 seconds that will get information about, say, memory consumption. But the main loop, the thing that it runs like every 5 to 10 seconds, runs queries against DMExec requests to tell you what all the active queries are, especially the ones that are waiting or causing waits in the system. It does a second query that for all the things that it got with the first query, the second query will return the statement that's being run and the procedure it's a part of, which is very helpful for narrowing down what you want to look at, right, of blocking chains you might have. And so one of the things I would do at times to diagnose a situation very quickly is I would just open up that file, look at kind of the information we were getting from DMExec requests about active queries, and I would have that open in Notepad++ or TextPad, and I would just thumb through that very quickly because it'll run these queries, like, I don't remember if it was every 5 or 10 seconds. But each one, you're just getting one snapshot, right, of what your running queries and what your weights look like. But if you see one snapshot and another, and you can thumb through them all really quickly, it's easy to come up with an overall impression of what's going on. And to say, oh, well, yeah, I've got some I/O weights here and there, but that's not that big a deal. But I've got CX packet weights lined up for days. I need to figure out what's going on with that.
No, it's interesting. So you mentioned that, and I agree that the idea of the snapshotting is very important. One of the things that I actually, will have done at the past summit is talking a bit about baselines. So how do you,
Yes.
I guess, thoughts around leveraging a tool like this, which is kind of a snapshot, but in a sense to give you,
Yes.
you want a broader than just what's my current CPU, right? You want a little bit more history than that. But it's not something that you're going to be running for weeks at a time either.
Yes. I'd really consider using Nexus with that because of the fact that you can gather PSSDiag whatever time you want to. If you want to gather an hour or two worth of data at whatever time of day you feel would be most appropriate, go ahead and do that. But then use Nexus with that, and you've got a very visible, you've taken that data set and made it very visible and very easy to look at and to refer back to later, because it's like you've got all the perfmon data is in there and averaged out, and you can say, okay, in there and averaged out, and you can say, okay, for these 2 hours, this was my CPU consumption, this is what disks looked like, this is how much free memory I had. Here's what my main queries were, here's what my main wait types were, here's what my resource consumption per procedure looked like. And you can have that kind of information from multiple sources and have it easily accessible through SQL Nexus.
Okay. So you mentioned you kind of switched off of it.
Yes.
So when do you feel like is the handoff point? It seems like it's a very handy tool, particularly when you're, I don't want to say going in blind, right? But again, if you think about the origin, right? So I'm a support person. Somebody calls me up. I don't know who they are. Or I've never seen the system, before. I want to get as much information as possible. Where do you see? Yes,
and that is frequently the approach.
Yeah, no, that's right. So where do you kind of see the handoff, or the evolution, perhaps? I need to get information about this, but even if I'm, whether I'm new or whatever, I've just been tasked for this database to using PSSDiag to, okay, now I know something about it. Maybe I don't need to use all the pieces. I'm more comfortable with the DMVs or something like that, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the more that you know the environment you're dealing with, the easier it is to transition to using a smaller data set. I think part of the reason PSSDiag is as useful as it is for Microsoft, for say a Microsoft engineer, is They don't know what your environment looks like, and they don't necessarily know what they're looking for. They don't necessarily know what, say, unusual SP configure settings you have. There's a lot of things that could potentially be the problem, and there are more things that they might need to consider. Now, in my case, part of the reason I made the transition and started doing more of my troubleshooting with DMVs, at least wherever possible, and to me, there are still circumstances you just can't replace PSSDiag because of some of them, was just for efficiency. So let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say that you're the customer and I'm working as Microsoft. We gather half an hour of data off of your very busy production server. You end up with, say, 3 or 4 gigabytes worth of data in your output folder. You start zipping that up. You're going to have to upload that to Microsoft. There's a tool within Microsoft that when you upload that, it'll go ahead and unzip it and run it through a SQL Nexus output. And I'll eventually, as the support engineer, would get an email, basically the SQL Nexus stuff already run. And then the Nexus analysis, that can take some time. A large data set, that can take a couple hours.
Sure.
So I was actually on a crit sit, if you're familiar with the term. I was on a crit sit with somebody in one case, and they had a high CPU issue. He had been trying to troubleshoot it himself, and actually the problem went away before he contacted Microsoft, and I was still working with Microsoft at the time. By the time I get on the phone with him, the situation's been over for 2 hours. By the time I get on the phone with him, the situation's been over for 2 hours. PSSDiag, I could configure PSSDiag and send it to him and say, okay, if your problem happens again, start running this and give me a call. But I kind of wanted to see if I could do something more than that, and I was thinking, and I said, so how did the problem go away? What happened? And he told me, well, it just it stopped on its own. I was trying to figure out what was going on, and it just stopped. I didn't do anything. And I said,
Watch your effect.
And I asked,
Interesting.
So I asked the guy, I was like, okay, did you restart SQL or did you say flush the procedure cache? Because that's the thing a lot of people will do. And it was kind of frustrating when you were a Microsoft engineer. Oh, is the problem still going on? Oh no, I rebooted the server. Oh well, I guess I can't gather any actual data. But
Right.
he hadn't restarted and he hadn't flushed the procedure cache. And so I thought to myself, well, whatever plans were consuming all the resources, consuming all the CPU, they should still be cached. Let's go run a query against dmexec. And I ran that and we looked at the output. And he had about 5 or 6 queries that were consuming significantly more CPU than anything else. Like you look at them in descending order, and after about query 5, the CPU dropped by 3 digits. And that's actually unusual. Very often when I see a high CPU case and I'm looking in the DMVs, you'll see that there's 1 or 2 things that's really killing it. But in this case, I use the DMVs. I'm able to see the cached plans. We can look at the cached plans. We can go find the procedure that is related to it. We look at the table. We look at the indexes. I was able to get to everything I needed just from running a query basically against dmexec query stats. And I didn't have to have him gather data and upload it to me, and I spend hours waiting for the data and then analyzing the data and then get back to him. I had an idea very quickly of what was going on. And after that one, that made a really compelling argument to me about the efficiency of using, say, the DM.
In there, sort of comparing that efficiency and then getting all the information there. I mean, if you've got a new server that you're now responsible for, or you're going to take over maintenance on, would you say that, I mean, PSSDiag would be a great place to start to get that sort of baseline so that you know what's going on with it and then later deal with the DMVs, or are you just sort of skipping it sometimes and going directly to the DMVs?
I think you could do either approach. And again, using PSSDiag and the Nexus will give you very visible data. I think the way it presents things might be easier for some people to see and understand and realize what normal is and how this is different from that.
Right.
But with the DMVs, I think one thing that would be effective would be to have ongoing normal processes where you collect information from, say, dmexec query stats or dmexec requests and put that into a permanent table that you're going to do some of this at Channel Advisor to keep track of, say, dmexec request information so that we can see weights that are going on inside the system. And we can look back at a given period of time and see what kind of weights we normally see on a Wednesday at 2:00 in the afternoon. We can see that.
Yeah.
So
interesting.
You could do either approach. Like I said, I like Nexus for the fact that it has a decent GUI on it, but you could also just take the DMVs, have automated things to gather that sort of information. It depends on how long you want to retain that information. You'd have to be a little more careful about, trimming your tables if you're taking that raw DMV information and storing it somewhere, as opposed to, say, running the PSSDiag and running the Nexus. Now you have the Nexus output. You can actually get rid of the PSSDiag data, however many gigabytes that is. You can also, Nexus takes the data and puts it into a database. And it actually needs a database within SQL Server that it can connect to and a database within SQL Server that it can connect to and jumble all the numbers around. But you can back up that database. And then at whatever point you can move it to another server, you can point SQL Nexus at it, and it's very effective in that fashion.
Okay.
So for baselining, to me, you could use either one.
Sure.
It just depends on your own preferences.
So we talked about wanting to hit some of the new features, and I think you've mentioned a couple of them. Obviously, Nexus being one. So as far as I'm sure the documentation has improved a bit. So you mentioned some of the parameters or settings that it could have. So
yes,
if I just run PSSDiag with no parameters, right? I'm going to get the event log. I'm going to get the SQL Server log. I'm going to get a profiler trace. I'm assuming that's still the default. You mentioned I can get X events. I'm assuming that's a parameter change.
Yes.
And then I'm going to get the performance
general performance, right?
And then I'm going to get the performance monitor metrics. So what other common parameters am I using when I'm talking about PSSDiag?
Well, the thing currently is, and this is where people go wrong with it or can go wrong with it, is now they've got it so there's basically default packages or default scenarios or scenarios that you can just basically say, I want to gather general performance or I want to gather detailed performance. And one of the things that I would suggest people not do with PSSDiag is, especially on a production environment, would be to go in and start by telling it to do, say, a detailed performance output before you're familiar with the tool and have an idea of how much data it's going to capture in your environment. I'd go with like a general or a light option. The big difference between, say, a general or a light capture and doing a detailed capture, then SQL, you're using Profiler or X events, you'll get, say, RPC started and completed, and you'll get, say, SQL batch started and completed. And you'll get errors and you'll get, a bunch of other things as well. But the main things you'll be interested in is batches and stored procedures starting and completed. When you go to detailed, you're going to gather a lot more events because you're going to gather statement level events. You're going to gather every statement starting and completed within SQL Server, and you're going to gather execution plans of whatever type you've selected or whatever type is the default for the detailed package currently. Think about it. If you've got a stored procedure and that stored procedure has 50 statements in it, then by going to a detailed trace, you're going to gather, instead of gathering 2 events for that stored procedure starting and stopping, you're going to gather those 2 plus 50 for each statement starting, 50 more for each statement stopping, and for each non-trivial statement, you're going to capture the execution plan. So there's a big difference in terms of how much data you're going to capture the execution plan. So there's a big difference in terms of how much data you're going to be gathering, and thus it's going to be more likely to affect the performance of the system in some way. And it can. And if your SQL Server is pushing 2,000 transactions per second, that's probably not a problem. If it's pushing 25,000 transactions per second, the same package might bring that server to its knees. And especially if I'm not familiar with running PSSDiag in my environment, I would start off with doing a general or doing a light and seeing how that works before I try to crank it up.
So I guess from that perspective, would it also make sense if someone's just learning it, if they have access to a test server that might have far less load, to just give it a test there first to make sure you understand what the light versus the more detailed is going to do?
Absolutely. And there are some interesting circumstances. Like there are things in there that are made for gathering information about always on or gathering information specifically about memory issues. My biggest concern with that, and I think there used to be one for there's still a collector for service broker, and there are circumstances you might want to gather those things because it provides a lot of information. There's one for linked servers it'll run all the queries to get information about what linked servers you have set up. So there's a number of useful little things like that. But my biggest concern with PSSDiag is people being too aggressive with the data that they're trying to return from it because it can affect performance. I had cases when I was working at Microsoft that I would go in with the PSSDiag package and we'd run it and we'd gather data and I'd analyze the data and realize, you know what, I can't use this because all I can see is the SQL trace weights. I can't tell what else is causing problems on the system because the tool is gathering so much information that we're waiting for that information to be written out. And it's affecting, and I can't see I can't see any other bottlenecks because of.
For someone who's about to go and give it a shot, maybe after listening to the podcast, any sort of, besides keeping the sampling light there,
Yes.
any other tips or suggestions to help someone get started?
One or two other that's big. Another thing that affects performance is running this over the network as opposed to running it locally on the server. Running it over the network is a real bad idea. I would dissuade you from doing this if at all possible. The idea is that SQL has these delays when it's trying to write the information out. Now, PSSDiag does a server-side trace. But if you're going to be using Profiler or using some other tool to do your tracing, I really would suggest not doing it remotely. You can run PSSDiag remotely and tell it to connect to this server at this name, but it introduces a much longer latency in terms of how long it takes for the trace to write out that data. Because now you're in network latency, and that is affecting how the SQL Server engine operates now.
Right.
And that would affect so that's a whole different magnitude. And the other thing would just be, the other thing I've seen that causes problems, and it's not specifically with PSSDiag, is not to run a whole lot of traces at one time, whether you're using Xevents or Profiler. There used to be tools that there used to be commercial tools, and I won't name any, and I probably can't remember all of them, but that would run 4 or 5 or more Profiler traces at a time. And that would affect the performance of the system because SQL Server is trying to write out things and keep track of things for each one of those different trace files. And especially when you're doing multiple and you're doing it over the network, that can be really consequential.
Yep. Interesting. Well, okay. So a side note, but on that running Profiler traces, what would your take be if someone wanted to run a Profiler trace like 24/7, 365, all day, all year, just to keep track of every query that's ever being run? How big of an impact is something like that going to have on performance?
Again, it would depend on how busy the server. On a busy production environment, I would ask them to define exactly what it is they're trying to find out here, because I don't think that's what they're trying to find out. I think that's a lot more information than you could reasonably use. How would you aggregate that information? What are you planning to do with it? And in any case, I would stay away from using Profiler at this point. In any case, because Xevents is now a superset and has been since SQL 2012, has been a superset of what Profiler can do. We have more kinds of events in Xevents now. It provides more information to you, and it's more efficient. It was designed from the ground up to be faster and to have less overhead than Profiler. So I'd really encourage you, if you're more familiar with Profiler, I entirely understand, but I'd really go ahead and pay that price because I think it's more than worth it.
All right. Well, shall we move into the SQL family section?
Sure. All for it.
So, Jared,
for SQL.
So, Jared, how did you first get started with SQL Server?
I got started when I was a part-time community college instructor. I had been teaching for one semester, and my older sister actually worked at one of the colleges I was working at, and she asked me if I knew anything about databases, and my answer was no. But at that point, the college, and this was Forsyth Tech in Winston-Salem, they did some certification classes for SQL Server, and one of them is actually in one of their 2-year degrees. And they needed somebody to teach these classes for the next semester, and so she came to me and asked if I could do that, and I said, okay, I'll look into it. And I basically picked up a book and taught myself enough of SQL Server to get certified in it, and then I taught the classes there for about 3 years. And from there, at that point, the interesting thing about teaching is whenever you're trying to teach people something, you have to know it to a greater degree than your teacher.
Interesting.
They'll ask you questions about the subject that you'll never think to ask yourself. So it's like you as a teacher end up learning even more from having students because you've already figured out all the questions you had in your head, but now you get a whole bunch more questions and you have to figure out how to answer them too. So I taught that for about 3 years, and that was when I applied for this help desky job that I saw on Monster, which actually turned out to be a contract position to go work at Microsoft in Charlotte.
Interesting. It's very similar almost to getting started like with presenting in a sense, right?
Yeah.
So if you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be and why?
That's actually pretty difficult. Trying to think of, I've had pain points here and there over the time. I've seen people do some horrible things with Service Broker. I'm trying to think, what else? At the moment, I guess the biggest thing could come up with is page latch waits, because they're a big concern in the side currently at work. So I guess I would try to find some way to eliminate that level of, shall we say, pessimistic concurrency. we're trying to move to doing a lot of things using in-memory optimized tables and whatnot to move to more optimistic concurrency, because with our throughput, with our load, we need to have that, and we need to get rid of the contention we get from page latch weights. That's a big consideration.
Okay, very nice.
What's the best piece of career advice you received?
Difficult to say. I think one of the things I would go back to is when I was still contracting, when I was still starting off at Microsoft, I was speaking with one of my tech lead at the time was Bill Carroll. He's now a escalation engineer. He's been at Microsoft forever. And I was working on some performance case, and I hadn't at that point had a lot of experience working. I had no experience before I came to Microsoft working on performance cases, and I was finding them difficult. And Bill Carroll said, we'll always have room for a video gamer and who knows how to handle performance cases around here. And so that I think really probably was the best piece of career advice, because at that point it gave me a niche, it gave me something to figure out and try to focus on, and I've done a lot with that. So I'll give Bill Carroll the nod there.
There you go.
And our final question, if you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why would you want it?
That's funny to me, in part because I'm an avid video gamer, and my wife and I used to play City of Heroes. So we have played as superheroes many times. For selfish reasons, I would like to say either flight or teleportation, because that would be really cool. But honestly, in real life, if I could have a superpower, it would be the power to heal other people. Just because who I am as a person, if I could do something that could make life better for somebody else, if I could take away something horrible that's happened to them, that would be a great thing to do.
Very cool.
All right.
Well, awesome. Well, Jared, thanks so much for being with us.
Same here.
We do want to thank Jared again for coming on the program, spending some time with us.
If you have other questions, obviously reach out to us. We'd love to continue to talk with you. Our music for SQL Server in the News is by Mansardi and used under Creative Commons. You can always reach out to us on social media or connect with us on LinkedIn. I'm at Carlos L. Chacon.
Or you can connect with me on LinkedIn at Steve Stedman. And we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.